Boone County Clerk Extraordinaire. Brianna L. Lennon was elected as Boone County Clerk in November 2018 and is running for a second term unopposed. She is a graduate of Truman State University and holds a master's degree in public policy and a law degree, both from the University of Missouri. Prior to her election as Boone County Clerk, Brianna served as an Assistant Attorney General in the Consumer Protection Division of the Missouri Attorney General's Office. Before joining the Missouri Secretary of State's office under former Secretary Jason Kander. In this position at the Secretary of State's office, she worked closely with local election authorities across the state to ensure that elections were simple, secure, and accessible for voters. Welcome, Brianna.
Hi, thanks for having me. I appreciate that really nice introduction. And thank you for Muleskinners for the invitation. I know that everybody voted on Tuesday, and so I hope everyone is not sick of hearing about elections and voting, but that's what I'm going to talk about today. So the first thing that I want to do is just talk about overall turnout and just kind of give you an overview of this last election. So for this election, we had just over 29,000 people vote, which amounted to about 23% overall turnout. And the denominator that we use there is active voters and inactive voters. And inactive voters are not people that are not eligible. It's just people that we have an old address for that they need to give us a new address for. And once we get a new address, they can go back to active status. So we include all of them because they are all potential eligible voters that could cast a ballot. And that is why we use that as the denominator. So it was a relatively low turnout, about 300 more voters than voted in the April election. It was under the amount that we had estimated, and I feel fairly confident that one of the reasons for that is because this is the first time in at least 12 years, that many elections, that we haven't had a countywide issue or a statewide issue on the ballot. So that really has a big effect on things. If you compare it to the 2018 election, which was the last kind of comparable election in terms of what was on the ballot, 2018 was also the year that the right to work referendum was on the ballot, when everybody was really, really active in signing that petition, getting the referendum on the ballot, and then voting in that. So we had an abnormally high turnout that year. 2020, we had that absentee catch-all reason of COVID, which I think also helped add to the number of people that felt comfortable voting in the election. So we ended up with 28% turnout. So unfortunately, this is not historically abnormal, but it is something that is not great. I don't feel wonderful about having 23% turnout. But at the end of the day, we still had a smooth election. By and large, what we heard back was positive feedback, and election night was one of the fastest that we've ever had. So our poll workers came back extremely, extremely timely, got back all of the results to us and the ballots to us very quickly. And so we ended up having a very fast election results turnout. We also had a very successful deployment of our 2 additional central polling locations. So lots of people voted at Friendship Baptist Church and also at Woodcrest Chapel because they were both additional central polling locations. We heard positive feedback from those as well, of people that even when they called in, if they called in, wanted to know where their polling place was, we would tell them, but we'd let them know about the other 3, and they'd say, oh, I'm right next to one of those. That's great. So I think it was definitely a positive thing that we did for August, and we appreciate everybody that helped and served as a poll worker to make that happen. Now, turning attention to the November election, the biggest thing that we are going to be grappling with is going to be voter education and implementation of the new voting law, which is House Bill 1878. It is 58 pages long. So there's a number of things in it, not just that affect voters, but also that affect the execution of things in our actual office. So right now, there will likely be a court challenge soon. And with that court challenge will be kind of some uncertainty about how much of the law is going to go into effect, when the law is going to go into effect, and what the court decides to do with regard to either like eliminating the entirety of the bill or just little portions of the bill. And I'm just gonna answer questions as we go too, since sometimes they're related to other things. So one of the questions was, do we have a for the August election, do we know Republican versus Democratic numbers? Yes, we do. So for the primary election, there were 13,620 Republican ballots cast, and for the Democrat, there were 15,752. I will put the results in the Zoom so everybody can see them. So that is the general breakdown. What I always tell people, candidates, voters, everybody, is that August numbers for those are not indicative of what's going to happen in November. People having to choose one party ticket, there's going to be a lot more people splitting tickets and changing their minds and voting for their friends versus, full ticket all the way down. This, because it forces people to choose everybody on one particular ballot, just has a different effect on what the numbers are. So yes, obviously we still are a trending blue county because that's just what the demographics bear out. But is it always going to be, 15,000 to 13,000? No, not necessarily. And that's something that is just a consequence of the way that we do our primary elections. So does anyone have any other questions on the August election? I should have just asked that before I went into November.
Someone commented that there were like 4,300 less, or fewer, I should say, Democrats voting this time, or on the rolls. Do you know if that's the case?
On the rolls would not be, we don't register by party, so there wouldn't be anything that would be different on the rolls.
Must have been by voting then.
And there may be if you compare it to the previous elections, but that's also because there were so many fewer people that actually voted in this election than in August of 2020 or August of 2018. So just the sheer number of all the ballots were lower.
Brianna, I believe if I'm correct, that in 2020 Medicaid expansion was on the August ballot. So I'm sure that drew.
That sounds right too, yeah.
Drew a lot more voters than usual, probably.
Yeah, we definitely, as we were training the election judges, that was one of the things that came up, because by and large, a lot of voters are not happy to have to pick one party ballot when they come to vote in August. And so there's always been a catch-all of a nonpartisan ballot. And this is the first election in at least 12 years where there was no nonpartisan ballot, unless you were in the 3rd ward, because the nonpartisan race was the city of Columbia. So yeah, this is the first time that there was literally nothing aside from partisan candidates on the ballot. Any other questions about this past election? We'll be certifying it on Monday. Yes, Herb. You're on mute. I don't know who's hosting it, if you have power to unmute.
I think a previous questioner was trying to get at the issue. What percentage of voters in this August election chose a Republican ballot versus a Democratic ballot? And how did that percentage compare to prior elections?
So that is a good question. So the Republican percentage was 46%. And in previous elections, if you compared it to 2020, let me pull that up real quick. The 2020 August election, the number of Republicans was 37%, which again, as Mari pointed out, with Medicaid on the ballot, that probably had an impact. And then for August of 2018, which is when Right to Work was on the ballot, it was 37% as well. So it was a little more, it was closer to a 50-50 split, or, you know, as close to a 50-50 split as we would have had. More, the demographics just were more, that more Republicans percentage wise voted, but the overall number of ballots cast was significantly lower too. So it's hard to generalize too much based on that for what's going to happen in November. Other than to say there was just a lot of candidate races on this particular ballot. And it's hard to say, you know, there's always people that get to pick different, we're not monitoring whether you pick a Democrat or Republican ticket. So it's possible that there was switching, you know, Democrats pulling Republican ballots or things like that this time. I don't know.
This may be getting a little ahead, but while we're on the subject, does the
Under.
new law change that? Does that change?
No.
Okay, so we don't have to register with a certain party in order to receive that party's ballot in the primary?
You do have to register with a party now, but it will have no impact on anything. So one of the changes of the new law is that there is an optional field for you to pick a party affiliation. That will start in January of 2023. And that affiliation will be the major political parties, or you can remain unaffiliated. It has no bearing on anything. It doesn't change the way that you pick a ballot. It doesn't change the way that you are allowed to do anything. But it will be part of your voter record, and it will be a public part of your voter record. They've made it so that you can, when you ask for a voter list, it will have the political affiliation that the voter has chosen on it as well. So it may be, I don't want to say that that's always going to be the case. It is entirely possible that this was passed as a, you know, this is the first into a step of locking us into closed primary. It's entirely possible, but at this point, the law does not lock us into anything. We have more questions. Al has a question.
Yes, Brianna, in relation to what you just said, I thought 2023 we were going from a primary type election to caucuses.
For the presidential preference primary, correct. But we will still have an August primary ballot like we do now.
Aha, okay, thank you.
Sue, you have a question?
Yes. This may not be a question so much for you or as for David Luthold, but for people that contribute to campaigns quite a bit, it probably is known what party affiliation you have. Am I correct? So what is the negative of announcing your party affiliation.
Like having it tied to your voter record?
Yeah.
I think it's kind of subjective. I mean, some people would say that it's not negative at all because it just provides you with the ability to have more information and you have more targeted advertising. I mean, it'll make it for sure less likely for people to get ads from the other party. If it's obvious that you're a Democrat, Republicans aren't going to be sending you something. So it takes out some of that uncertainty for campaigning. Although from just, I think, a general voter that doesn't affiliate right now with a political party, what I have seen from my colleagues in other, not necessarily other counties, but in other states, they've seen increasing numbers of people identifying as independent or unaffiliated. And so there are some places that have this already where people have to choose, where now the unaffiliated numbers are larger than the numbers of people that affiliate with a Democrat or Republican. So it has more to do with kind of like the data on the voter and less to do with the voters, you know, interest in identifying as one way or the other. Any other questions before I dig into 1878? Okay, so obviously the biggest thing that 1878 has included in it is the photo ID component. And the thing that I try to remind people, because I think it's not very clear in this bill, is that it really locks it down to a very finite number, even more than in previous iterations of photo ID, that a lot of people are going to be surprised about. So it's one of the reasons why the lawsuit and the uncertainty has been affecting what kind of voter education we're going to do. This law goes into effect August 28th. So beginning August 28th is when everything will really kind of start blowing up and changing. The acceptable IDs that are going to be allowed are driver's licenses, Missouri driver's licenses, not out-of-state driver's licenses. Those will no longer be allowed. They have to be Missouri driver's licenses or Missouri non-driver's licenses. Those two are the big two that are named in the law that are going to be probably the majority of things that people already have that they're going to show. You could also use a passport or any kind of federally issued ID, as long as it has an expiration date. You can also use something that's issued by the state of Missouri, as long as it has an expiration date. Or you can use a military ID. Those are really it. Student IDs do not count anymore. Out-of-state licenses do not count anymore. The voter ID cards that get issued out of my office do not count anymore. All of the things, MU Health employee ID do not count anymore. Things that are issued by a state entity have to have an expiration date on them, or at least mark that they're non-expiring. That's a huge thing that I think it's missed in this law when people are talking about it. And for college students especially, not being able to use the student ID or not being able to use the out-of-state ID are the big things that they're going to miss. Now, the caveat to all of this is that if you don't have one of those forms of ID, the solution is that you will vote a provisional ballot, and that provisional ballot is a blue envelope provisional ballot. So when we're talking about provisional ballots that don't count, we're talking about yellow envelope provisional ballots. Those are ballots that are issued because we can't figure out if you are eligible to vote, you're not on the list, and we can't figure out why you're not on the list. Maybe you thought you registered to vote and you didn't. You're at the wrong polling location and you don't have time to get to your new polling location, but you just want to cast your ballot just to make sure that you do something on election day. Whatever reason it is that we can't figure out if you are allowed to vote in the first place, you get a yellow provisional ballot. 99% of the time, those do not count because we do search on election day to see if there is any way that you can vote. And if we get to the point of issuing you a provisional ballot, it's pretty likely that even the additional research we do leading up to certification is not going to yield any better result. So 9 times out of 10, Yellow provisional ballots don't count, which is why you always hear people saying, well, provisional ballots never count anyway. Blue provisional ballots are an entirely different situation. Blue provisional ballots are for anybody that does not have an ID. We use those now. I've never seen one not count. And the reason for that is blue provisional ballots count as long as the signature on that envelope matches the signature on your voter registration record. And we keep several iterations of voter registration signatures. So it's not like we only have one version and my signature's changed and does it still match and everything else. We have lots of things to compare it to. I've never seen a bipartisan election judge team say, I'm just not sure that that was the person that signed this envelope. They are going to find that the signatures match. Now, so that's a good thing. That's the good thing is that if you don't have an ID, your ballot's going to count. The big issue that I am concerned that's going to happen from this and why I'm trying to get ahead of it is to the extent that I can and get people IDs that they need, or at least let people know that they need these IDs, is that filling out a blue provisional ballot at the polling location takes longer. It means the lines are going to be longer. And I can't adjudicate those blue provisional ballots on election night. So if we have even 2,000 blue provisional ballots that are cast across the county, when they come back on election night, that's 2,000 votes that I can't count. And if we have a close race, then there's a big possibility that I'm not going to have the results of that race until after we can bring in a bipartisan election judge team to do verification, which by law can't start until after noon on the Friday following the election. So it's going to potentially, if all of this bears out and we do have a large number of blue provisional ballots, delay our results and potentially delay the expected returns. Now, that is something that happens in lots of states anyway. Lots of states have this longer cure period. They have things that end up taking time, and so it would not be out of the realm of possibility. People can expect that, but that is a tempering of expectations that we would have to do in order to make sure that people understand that this is why it's happening. It's not a problem. It is actually a very natural consequence of the way that the law is written. That may has a question.
Yeah, Brianna, you mentioned 2,000, and I think that was hypothetical, but do you have a sense of the number of provisional ballots you'll receive based on the experience in other states, or any estimates of the proportion of voters that will be adversely affected?
So I don't have any way to determine based on how it's worked in other states, but what I can tell you is if you take November of 2020 as an example, which is when we had our highest turnout, but that's also when we had a central poll on campus, just like we will for this November. And in Novembers are when our students actually count, or usually come out to count their ballots and things like that. The overwhelming majority of people are using their driver's licenses already. I mean, we pick, when we have our poll workers check people in, they are choosing which ID that they're selecting to check before they get a voter in. Now, that is not to say that the people that don't show us driver's licenses don't have them, but we don't know that. If all you take is the number of people that used, like, for example, the number of people that used another out-of-state driver's licenses. So if they used another state driver's license, pretty likely they don't have a Missouri driver's license. 640 people across the county. So that's 640 right there. How many people used their student ID? 522. So, I mean, they add up over time. If you just take those all into account, how many use their sample ballot mailing instead of using a voter ID card or a driver's license? 2,500. And how many use their voter ID card? 7,000. So it's pretty impossible to get a good determination of exactly how many provisionals it could be, but it could be anywhere in those numbers. David,
I feel for you. Thank you.
David's got a question.
I have a question. When I go to the polls, they ask for an electronic signature, and the electronic signature doesn't I have difficulty writing that properly. How do you match those up?
So we keep those on file, but also on file are your voter registration card and any of your changes of address that you would do. Excuse me. So we have multiple versions of all of the different signatures that you give us over the years. We keep all of those.
Oh, okay. And so you make it a decision that is my signature, even though it doesn't look like it to me.
Well, we may compare it to the last written one that you have.
Okay, all right.
Dave has a question?
Does expired Missouri driver's license still count?
It only counts if it has expired after, I think it was after the last general election.
Oh, my.
So yes, so people will have to renew their driver's licenses or non-driver's licenses.
I mean, for seniors who just quit driving, they keep their driver's license as their ID and they're not going to renew it.
Yes, that's going to be another demographic that we're going to have to do some pretty extensive education and awareness on in
Oh,
order
boy.
to get those.
Thanks.
Kathy, you have a question?
Yes, and maybe you're probably planning to address then all the ways that you're planning to educate Boone Countyans about what they need as far as voter ID.
Yes.
I guess my
So
question is, what are the ways you're planning to do that?
yes. So some of it will have to be like literally in person, going to different places and kind of going on a tour and educating people. Some of it will have to be on social media. Some of it will have to be hopefully, like earned media, where we'll put out press releases and try to work with our media, our local media, to try to get information out, accurate information out. I've been in contact with the Secretary of State's office and the Department of Revenue to see what kind of education they're going to be doing as well. The thing that is difficult is obviously the uncertainty of how much of the bill will go into effect and what a court says about it. So in my general attitude is putting out information and getting people to get IDs in hand, even if the law gets overturned, doesn't hurt anything, because then somebody's got an ID that didn't have an ID before. So we will start, I mean, as soon as it goes into effect on August 28th, that's when we'll start pushing stuff out. Scott, you have a
Great.
question?
Yes, I do. And I was going to switch it a little bit to voter registration because there's a lot of changes on that. And how's that going to be enforced? And exactly what's going to be involved and how it differs from the way we used to do it.
Yeah, so there's two aspects of voter registration that this law has an impact on. One is that you cannot be paid to register voters, which has a bigger impact, not on volunteers, but on people that work that are paid employees of an organization or of a nonprofit that part of their job right now is to do voter registration. And that is an entirely different thing that they're going to have to figure out. I know a lot of them are talking to their own in-house attorneys about that. But the thing that affects volunteers is the aspect that says that if you register to vote more than 10 people, then you need to file a form with the Secretary of State's office. So there are a few open questions about that, including at what point in the process do you need to fill out that form? Do you fill out the form before you have to register to vote 10 people or after? Does it include if you're just handing out blank voter registration forms or if you're collecting them specifically? I will say that this particular part of the law existed in the past. This is not a brand new thing that we've never done before. Voter registration solicitors have existed in the law for a long time. And the law changed kind of recently to not require the form, and now it's just changed back again to require the form. So Part of it will rely on the Secretary of State's office to get the form out in an accessible way. I will keep copies of the form here and we'll be able to email out forms and things like that, but those forms will go directly to the Secretary of State's office. So when I get any kind of guidance from the Secretary of State's office on what they plan to do, if they're going to make it an online form or they're going to make it a PDF or however they're going to do it, I will let everybody know how that is going to work. But essentially what it means is if you're going to register people, better safe than sorry, fill out the form with the Secretary of State's office just so that they have something on file. And then the other thing about the law that I do want to remind people of is that there is a provision that says that that people cannot solicit voters to obtain an absentee ballot application. Now that particular portion of the law, I know just from talking to people that were working on this particular law and from hearing what the complaints were in committees, was that it was targeted towards organizations and campaigns that were pre-filling out absentee applications and mailing them to people. So people got 3 or 4 versions of absentee applications in the mail, and then especially in smaller communities would just flood the county clerk's office with calls about why are you sending me an application form and I've already voted and this is totally inappropriate. And so this is to prevent people from sending out application forms unsolicited to voters. The perhaps unintended consequence of that is there's now uncertainty as to what would be considered a solicitation of an absentee ballot application. So that is something to keep in mind as people are doing education and, you know, registering voters at events and things like that. Keep in mind that that law does exist and it is not particularly clear. There is no good way for somebody to say, okay, here's exactly what solicitation is. So as long as you don't do that, you're fine. I just like to advise people that that is a thing. So obviously we will still be available for absentee voting. And speaking of that, the last thing, which is a positive thing that this law does, is that it creates a 2-week no excuse period of absentee voting. So what voting will look like in November, let's pretend that this law is going to go into effect just like it is. As we get closer to the election, 6 weeks before the election, we'll start our absentee voting period. You'll be able to request your absentee ballot in our office or by mail. That's 6 weeks. You'll continue on, and as you get to 2 weeks before the election, if you come into our office, you will not have to state your reason for voting absentee, and you will be able to cast your ballot in our office. If you're voting by mail, you're always going to have to state your excuse for voting absentee. But 2 weeks out from the election, you're not going to have to. Everybody is going to be able and eligible to come to our office and vote absentee. I expect that it'll be very similar to 2020 when we had the COVID excuse, and lots of people will want to take advantage of that. So we will be doing more outreach and probably weekend events and things like that in order to allow people to take advantage of the no excuse absentee portion. But the thing to know also is that photo ID does apply to absentee voting in person as well. So people will still have to show a photo ID when they come to absentee vote in person, but they will have the ability for that 2 weeks leading up to the election to come into our office and vote before the election without having to have a reason why. So that's a positive thing. Pam, you have a question?
My question is about poll workers. It sounds to me like they're going to have different training now. So when will the training start?
So we will do our training probably starting the beginning to middle of October will be when we do that. We always try to do it throughout the month in advance so that people have enough time to go through the training.
Okay. Do you foresee that you'll have any problem getting poll workers?
I will always take more poll workers. If people want to advertise and try to tell people to serve as poll workers, I will not I will not be sad about that.
Okay.
And there's a bounty now.
There is a bounty now. We do have a referral. If you are a poll worker and you refer somebody to us and they work the election, then you get $25.
Oh,
I'm working on that. Brianna, is there any way to get a photo ID by way of mail, or do people have to travel to a DMV office or somewhere else?
Right now, they will have to travel to a DMV office in order to get a non-driver's license or a driver's license, yes.
Oy. And
you can
regarding
get a passport at the library.
That's true. You can get a passport, but a passport is more expensive.
Right.
And technically under the law, a non-driver's license for the purpose of voting would be free. The DMV will provide that for free. So there is that option. And then the Secretary of State's office, if you have trouble getting your birth certificate or a divorce decree or anything that you need to show documentation to get the non-driver's license or driver's license, Secretary of State's office will help you get that. And in cases where it's going to cost money, they will also pay for it.
I think right now, people who are disabled can register to get absentee ballots mailed to them, and they don't need a notary to send them back. Does that continue?
That continues, yes. Nothing, that's a great question. There's nothing that is affecting the existing absentee structure. So if you have a permanent disability, then you are able to sign up for the permanent disability list. The permanent disability list doesn't give you a ballot for every election, but it gives us the ability to send you an application for every election. So
Got it.
it's not as immediate as getting a ballot, but you would at least for every election get a paper in the mail that all you'd have to do is sign and send back, and then we would send you an absentee ballot. And the photo ID component does not have any impact on absentee voting by mail. So by mail absentee voting remains exactly the same.
Good. And there's no provision for clerk's offices or the Secretary of State's office to create photo IDs?
There is a provision that relates to the county clerk's office working with the Department of Revenue to perhaps do that. And I am exploring that option, but it's never been done before. And I'm not exactly sure what's going to come out of that, but I am exploring that option.
Thank you.
Carol?
Yeah, Brianna, on the no excuse absentee voting, I thought there was a provision that if the photo ID gets overturned, then they take away the no excuse absentee voting.
That is true. If something happens with the law, then those two things are related under the law. But not knowing what the court case is going to look like or what parts of it they're going to try to have an impact on, I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen, but that is true that the photo ID and the no excuse absentee are tied to each other under this law. So if we lose photo ID, we also lose the 2 weeks of no excuse absentee. Any other questions?
I have a question about, I think there's a provision in there somewhere that changes the ability of county clerks to provide lists of registered voters or changes the circumstances for that. Am I wrong, or is there some change in that?
So all that it says is that they can't be used for commercial purposes, which is another one that used to be what the law was, and then it changed, and now it's just changed back. The other thing for, which I think a lot of people will be happy about, for security purposes, the list will no longer have full dates of birth. It will only have the year. So we already made that change, or I guess it just says year. We already made that change on our voter lookup tool, just in anticipation of this law going into effect. So now if you noticed, if when you looked yourself up, it doesn't show your full birth date anymore, you still have to put in your full birth date to find yourself, but when it views it, it will only show you the year of your birth.
And I was referring more to lists of voters that are provided to candidates.
Yeah, that's that. So that list of voters that's provided candidates, that's what changes. You can't see the full birthday. And as long as you're not using it for commercial purposes, then that's fine. Dave has a question.
Are you allowed to express your opinion about this upcoming new law? And if so, what is it?
My opinion is that it has a lot of unintended consequences and is going to impact a lot of voters in a lot of negative ways. And there are obviously some positives like no excuse absentee, which clerks and I have been fighting for a long time. I would much rather have more than just 2 weeks of no excuse absentee. So I think the bill certainly could have been better in that regard too. But I think the photo ID component is going to have a lot of unintended negative consequences that people did not realize because of how strict it is and how many people are going to be affected. And like I said, that the two concerns that I have are that confusion about the law is going to reduce turnout and keep people away from the polls, because not necessarily that they don't have an ID, but that they're going to be too confused or concerned of violating the law or of not having the right ID, that they're just going to say it's not worth it and they're not going to go. And so we're going to have lower turnout because people are just going to be so kind of dissuaded from going. And the second is having those blue provisional ballots delay our ability to give election night results in a timely way, and that's surprising people and making people lose confidence in the process.
Brianna, I want to say that I think you're being very generous when you say that it's an unintended consequence of the law. Very generous of you.
I think that even the people that were in support of this law have unintended consequences of, like, I don't think that, I think that there are things that they didn't think about, like the fact that the blue provisional ballots, like, I don't think anybody thought, oh, it's okay because we're going to have later election results. Nobody everywhere has ever said, we want there to be a longer period of time where we don't know who's going to win. And this is a very natural consequence of the way that the law is written. It would not be surprising, shouldn't be surprising to anybody to say, well, fine, if I don't have the right ID, then we'll have these blue provisional ballots. That's fine. If people decide to not get an ID and want to go vote anyway, then the argument has always been, well, there's an avenue, you have blue provisional ballots. Well, that's fine, but you've hit a critical mass of those people that want to vote blue provisional ballots, or you have a certain demographic like college students that don't have IDs and have no interest in getting a driver's license because they want to keep their old driver's license. Then this is what we're going to have to deal with. And we're not going to have our results in a timely manner because of it. Carol, you have a question?
I just want people to know that this law intentionally says the Secretary of State does not have to educate voters about these changes. And secondly, I want to say that in the bill, I believe in law, it says you can't change election law 6 months before elections. And I can't understand why this bill is changing law 3 months before an election.
That is a great question that I don't have a good answer to.
There are a couple hands up. Kathy?
I was wondering, I think you alluded to there being lawsuits going on, and I was wondering if you can tell us if there are and who is suing about this legislation.
They have not been filed yet. So I don't know right now. I just know that there will be. I just don't know who or when or what.
Okay, thank you.
Herb, do you have a question?
I know that you have frequently spoken before about your commitment to the idea that more people participating in voting is good. Virtually all of your predecessors dating back, except one, dating back to before Chris Kelly, have had the same view. One of the things that I am aware for the last 50 or maybe 60 years, certainly, possibly back to high school civics, and Dave Luthold reminds me of this periodically, is one of the greatest correlates of higher turnout versus lower turnout in elections across polities, over history, and across nations is number one, the number of elections in a year, and two, the length of the ballots. Nonetheless, we persist in making ballots longer and more elections, and then decrying that there's low turnout. What should we do about this?
I think we are really in a catch-22 when it comes to that, because that's something that has come up in the legislature too, where people have wanted to do away with the April election to merge it with November, under the argument that, well, we'll have higher turnout for these races that don't right now, like the city council races and the school board races. But as you said, what I have reminded people of is down ballot drop off is a very real issue when you've got extremely long ballots. So I have jokingly, at least to some legislators, said, I have no problem with you doing that as long as you put city council and school board at the top of the ballot for the November elections, because then you can have down ballot drop off all day long. And if people really want to vote, then that's what they can vote on. So I do think we do love voting on things in the United States. And I think that that is a great thing because democracy is very important. But then you do end up in these situations because we have so many different things on the ballot for each election, that it does get overwhelming. And there's a lot of people that don't feel like they have done enough research, or they can't find enough research, or they're just not interested enough to make a decision in each of those races. So I wouldn't have any problem with consolidating things, but I wouldn't want to do it under the faulty premise that, well, it means that more people will vote in all these local elections, because I just don't think that it will.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Mari or Carl, do you have a question?
Well, this is Carl. Brianna, I just want to express my appreciation for how you handled the tie. It was a testimony of neither of us wanting to flip a coin or whatever. I think you handled it professionally, and I think the results of the last election and how quickly they came out is also a testimony to the good work that you're doing in the office. So my appreciation.
I appreciate that, and thank you. And thank you for all your service on the city. That's very, very important, and I've appreciated that as well.
If I could just make a plug for poll workers, I've been one for the last half dozen or so elections. I know many Muleskinners also are. I got to tell you, the one thing that I like most about it is working with people of other parties who aren't nuts. Everybody who shows up is there for the same reason. And, I haven't ever been involved in one where everybody didn't get along famously. I've formed some new friendships with people from other parties because of that. And it's what democracy is all about. And it's I think the one of the most useful things we can do as citizens, and also one of the most rewarding. And I appreciate the ability to do it. I just wish it wasn't a 19-hour day.
Well, thank you for saying that. I may have to use you in a testimonial to get more poll workers. That was very nice. We appreciate you serving so much.
Anyone else? Anyone else have any questions here? Well, on behalf of Muleskinners and behalf of my position on the Muleskinners, thank you for being here. It's been very informative. And as usual, you've conducted yourself in a distinguished way in this very important role that you have in our city. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Brianna.
Thank you all. Please stay tuned now for the executive committee meeting, which will be coming up. Everyone is invited. So thank you to Brianna and everybody on the executive committee. Stick around.